Welcome, everyone. I'm Jerry Wasserman. I want to welcome you to our live online, socially distanced UBC Senior Scholar Series. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Carl Walters, Professor Emeritus in UBC's Department of Zoology and the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. Let me begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. We are grateful to live and work here. The Senior Scholar Series, The Passions That Drive Academic Life, an initiative of the UBC Emeritus College, has been run in conjunction with Green College since 2011. This is our final presentation of the bizarre 2021 fall and winter season. We will have heard from 6 accomplished, articulate, inspiring, entertaining emeriti via Zoom, not the best of circumstances, obviously, but we've made do. All credit goes to our participants, along with our fearless leader, Graham Wynn, and our tech genius, Alan Gumbach. Thank you both for organizing and smoothing out our journeys. God and Pfizer and Bonnie Henry willing, we'll all be vaccinated by next fall, and the series can return to the live in-person format of old. So stay tuned. If you've attended any of our previous sessions, you'll be familiar with the format. Carl and I will have a 45-minute or so conversation, followed by a Q&A. Please type your question or comment on chat at the bottom of your screen at any time during the hour, and I'll relay the question to Carl during the Q&A segment. If you have your video on, you can raise your hand during the Q&A and we'll unmute your microphone so that you can actually ask a question out loud. If your video isn't on, we can't see you, so we can't operate that way. You'll have to use chat. If we still have some momentum at 6 o'clock, Carl will hang around for a few more minutes and answer further questions. We call this part of our presentation happy hour. And we encourage you to either leave or stay and pour yourself a glass of wine. Carl's already got his intact, and stick around and chat for a few more minutes. Now to the reason why we're here. Carl Walters is Emeritus Professor of Fisheries at UBC in the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries and the Department of Zoology. With expertise in fish population dynamics, fisheries assessment, and sustainable management, Carl has had a lot to do with helping to save and sustain wild BC salmon stocks. His development of systems analysis techniques and mathematical modeling around ecosystems has had significant impact beyond fisheries and beyond BC's borders. Carl has been honored with the Order of British Columbia, membership in the Royal Society of Canada, and a series of major international prizes, including the Volvo Environment Prize, the American Fisheries Society Award of Excellence, and the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas Prix d'Excellence. Carl's title tonight, Adaptive Management, Learning to Manage Complex Natural Systems Through Experience and Active Experimentation, applies, I think, as much to Carl's life as to his research and professional accomplishments. And I hope to tease out some of those adaptations and complex systems that he has lived through. So welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
How are you today? And where are you zooming us from?
The edge of the UBC campus. I was one of the lucky people that managed to score a townhouse right where B-Lot used to be on the south edge of campus.
I guess it's been a relatively quiet year out there, not much traffic.
Yeah, it's getting more crowded, but yeah, it's nice to be able to go out and walk around campus and every day and so on, and not feel threatened.
Well, before we get into the bigger picture of your life and work, I have a salmon question for you. So I've been reading a lot about the unexpected side effects of the COVID pandemic on various aspects of life and the environment. So has this year of COVID had any effect on salmon stocks? Are there, say, fewer fishers catching salmon? Are there more people eating salmon? Is there any kind of causal relationship?
No, I think the only thing I've seen actually, the harvests have been in places like Alaska have been amongst the records historically. Prices are depressed a little bit because of depressed markets in Asia and that sort of thing. But no, fishing is an essential business, so the fishermen are still out there.
Okay, all right. We'll come back to that question of salmon stocks because I know you've got some very interesting data and theories about what's going on out there. I'm always interested in the routes by which people arrive at their destinations or their destinies, really. The crossroads, the roads not taken. You began in a very different kind of environment than the one you ended up in, studying ocean fisheries in a seaside city. Can you tell us about your where you grew up and what your youth was like?
Yeah, if somebody had told me 60 years ago that I would end up as a Canadian university professor, I would just laugh at them. I grew up in a very small desert town in the eastern deserts of California. There were 6 kids in my high school graduating class. So
Six.
6 kids. So they didn't teach college prep courses or anything like that. So I got into a junior college on a baseball scholarship with the intention of studying to be a game warden, as my grandfather had been, and my father for some time. And I intended to go for just 2 years, but I was so scared when I went to college that I studied really hard and got good grades, and they encouraged me to go on and get a bachelor's degree so I could be a biologist instead of a game warden because I'd earn more money. And so I did that, and I did well in the second pair of years. And so I stumbled into a graduate program where I was able to study high mountain lakes in Colorado. Each of these steps there was no planning, there was no ambition, there was no intent to do it. It just was an opportunity, and I figured I'd better grab it while I had the chance.
So
Uh, Really big break for me came in 1968 when, of all places in the world, the American Fisheries Society decided to hold their annual meeting in Tucson, Arizona in August. And so I went to give a student paper at this meeting because it was only an 8-hour drive from where I was going to school. And I won a student award, and Peter Larkin, who many of you know, came up to me at the meeting and said, "Well, I really enjoyed your talk. I'd like you to come to UBC and give the same talk." So a week later, I got a letter saying not only come to UBC, but we want to interview you for a faculty position. So I went to Vancouver in October 1968 in the pouring rain. I'd never really been in a big city much at all in my life. And I got off the airplane and it was just pouring rain. It was an awful mid-October day. And I saw all the greenery and I saw that city and I fell in love and just said, this is where I'll be for the rest of my life.
oh,
That was the end of it.
a love story.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's back up a little bit because I'm fascinated by the fact that both your father and your grandfather were game wardens.
Yeah.
And I also saw on your Wikipedia entry that you worked for the California Department of Fish and Game yourself.
Mm.
So what does a game warden do in the deserts of Southern California?
Well, the desert area where I grew up was right adjacent to the Sierra Nevada mountains. And Grandpa was a cattle rancher, and he ran his cattle up into the high Sierras for summer pasture. And we lost the ranch when the city of Los Angeles took all the water away from this area where I grew up called the Owens Valley. But Grandpa was fascinated as he traveled through the mountains with his cattle by all of these beautiful mountain lakes that he saw that didn't have any fish because there was no way for fish to get up the steep mountains after the glaciers left. So he started. Uh, it, he got a job as a game warden, and he started uh, hauling milk cans of trout up to these mountain lakes. And everybody told him, well, trout won't be able to live up there. And he said, well, you never know till you try. And he hauled all sorts of different trout from all over Western North America up to these lakes to see which trout would do best. I think that's really where I got the idea of management as experimentation was actually from Grandpa.
Yeah.
And one of the crazy examples of what he did, he hauled baby steelhead trout from California hatcheries, hauled them up to a lake at 11,000 feet in the Sierras, an alpine lake, and dumped them in there just to see what had happened. And darned if 3 years later, he didn't have this lake full of the same giant steelhead that many people like to fish for here in BC. So his kind of motto was truly, you must try, you must experiment to be successful as a fisheries manager or a warden or anything else.
Yeah. So were you a fisherman as a kid?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, of course. My dad was a fishing guide partly at times, and he started teaching me to fish when I was 5 years old. There was a little stream that ran through my hometown, ran out from the mountains into the desert. I could walk a block away from my house and catch little trout in the stream and bring them home for my mother to cook. Yeah. So yeah.
And I understand that you went to junior college that was on a baseball scholarship, or you
Yeah.
to play baseball, not necessarily to become what you became.
Yeah, well, it turned out I wasn't any good at the baseball, and I was dropped from the team almost immediately. But they did, because I studied so hard. It, I did get the academic basis to go on. I had to take various remedial courses like trigonometry and basic English and things like that. Yeah, it didn't stay that way. My little sister, who I see her face in the Zoom there, my sister Sandy, uh, graduated just a couple of years later than me in the baby boom era. And by then, this little school had a lot more kids, and they were teaching college prep courses, and all the kids went off to college. And so my UBC position. I never wrote an application for a job. The little sister, 2 years later, graduated in biochemistry, and I think the first job she applied for, there were 650 applicants for the job. So it was just this radical change in opportunity over just a few years there as the baby boom hit the
Yeah.
job market.
Sandra's put on chat that you and she were the only ones from your small school that went on to get a PhD.
Yep, wouldn't be surprised. She's a retired biochemistry prof from Cal State Northridge.
So the ambition runs in the family, along
I
with
don't
the
know.
initiative.
Yeah.
Seeding an alpine lake with steelhead. Have you done anything like that, the equivalent of that in your research down here?
Yeah. I've actually had students go back to the High Sierras where I used to live and work and study some of the populations that I'd been involved in planting and managing back when I was a summer assistant with the California Department of Fish and Game. So I let some of my students experience the same things that I did when I grew up. But yeah, we've done experimental work on lakes here, but most of the adaptive fisheries management stuff I've done has been on much bigger systems and on much more complicated environmental problems. I've worked on almost every major World Heritage site that has water in it. the Florida Everglades, the Great Barrier Reef, the Colorado River and Grand Canyon, places like that. So it's been much more of my time.
Do you want to talk about adaptive management and what you mean by it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. The kind of formal idea for adaptive management had its origins in the early 1970s when Buzz Halling, who many of you know was my mentor, and he helped encourage me to develop a workshop process that allowed us to bring together groups of scientists and managers and people with diverse knowledge and backgrounds and look at natural resource management problems. And back then, we had this idea that we could build computer models that would help us to manage these complicated systems better. Uh, this was in the days just after the lunar landing, and NASA had made a point about how the computer simulations that they did really helped them troubleshoot the whole complex problem of landing a man on the moon. And so we were encouraged to try to use some of the mathematical methods and so on that they developed to see if we could apply them to ecosystem management situations. So we started to run workshops on all sorts of different problems, caribou management in the Canadian Arctic, spruce budworm outbreak problems in eastern Canada, fisheries here on the BC coast, where we'd bring these people together and we'd try to sit with them and build a computer model. What we found when we tried to do that, building a computer model, all you do is you're just telling the computer what you think, giving it a set of rules that represent what you think drives changes in a system. Rules for how many animals are born, how many die, and things like that, interactions. Uh, what we found, two things. One of them was that there were these huge gaps in information. There was a huge amount of scientific information about some aspects of the ecology of these systems we were working on, aspects that were easy for scientists to work on. But there were also these processes that had defied research, that were too difficult to study in the field, like the dispersal of forest insects is incredibly difficult to study on large spatial scales. Critical for making predictions, but no data. So what we kept saying to these people was, well, the only way we can fill these gaps in knowledge is with guesses. And in the end, the only way you're going to find out if our guesses was right was to apply some of the policies that the models say you might consider. The other thing that happened at that time with some of these models was that the more biologically realistic and complicated we tried to make them, the more we tried to put in aspects of the biology and physiology and so on of the organisms, the more realistic we tried to make them, the more unstable the models became. Predators would eat up all their prey. There were violent cycles. The models would self-simplify. They wouldn't maintain the diversity that we observe in nature. And a lot of us at that time said, well, there's some basic thing that's missing in our understanding of about the dynamics of these systems. There's some rules that we just haven't identified yet. And so a lot of us gave up on the modeling, the ecosystem modeling at that point, just said, we have no idea what it is that's missing in our rules. But we had started these models were telling us that there were gaps that we could only fill through field experience, through experimentation. And then it was in '74, Halling arranged for me to do a sabbatical leave at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. And the office next to me was occupied by a famous systems theorist named John Casti. And we would sit and drink coffee in the mornings. And he would say, well, what do you do? And what's this fish stuff all about? And I started explaining that we were trying to understand how to deal with systems that had big unknowns in them, and to try to figure out how to manage these systems in a way that we could learn as we go along in management. And he said, that's an adaptive control problem. And so that's where the term adaptive management came from, was this casual conversation with a systems theorist. The systems theory people were very familiar with problems where you have to learn by doing. They're called dual control problems in their parlance. So that was just a couple of lucky strokes that led to at least the terminology of adaptive management.
So give me an example. Give us an example of applied adaptive management in
Oh
one
boy.
of your scenarios.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't resist this.
Okay.
The biggest example there's ever been is around us today with that damn pandemic. And I think if a careful adaptive management approach had been taken, we'd be far ahead of where we are today. We would probably, all of us on this screen would be vaccinated, like my little sister, and the COVID would have started to drop away in places like BC. The management of the pandemic has been a series of experiments. Nobody knew whether the lockdowns and things like that were going to affect the dynamics of the disease that much. Nobody knew whether vaccines that were being proposed and developed even as early as last March were going to have the efficacy that people wanted. So the whole process of managing the pandemic has been an adaptive management experiment, a sequence of adaptive management experiments done in different ways in different places. And we've learned a huge amount from it. But I think in terms of our experience here in BC, we've made two big mistakes in the adaptive management planning. Well, at least the Western world as well as BC. The first mistake was to wait too long to start using the vaccines. So the two major vaccines started their phase 3 trials near the end of July. And we were seeing the efficacy data from those by mid-September. It was pretty clear that the vaccines were very likely to work and very likely not to cause severe side effects. But the medical research community in particular demanded much higher certainty and demanded that these phase 3 trials be carried out for much longer than is optimal for an adaptive management experiment. So we were sitting there about in September, and my models were running, predicting COVID outcomes if they started vaccinating immediately or if they didn't. And my model said real clearly that if you keep delaying 1, 2, 3 months the application of these vaccines, you'll have tens of thousands of people die that very likely wouldn't die if they were vaccinated earlier, even if some people were killed by the vaccine, even if there were bad side effects for the vaccine. The basic risk analysis said they should have proceeded with vaccination much sooner than they did. The other big mistake we made here in BC was not to deploy rapid COVID testing. The medical community doesn't trust rapid COVID tests because they're not as accurate for medical diagnosis as the PCR tests that everybody knows about. But if they're used for screening to catch infected people earlier, they can make a huge difference to the infection transmission dynamics of the disease. So we should have deployed those rapid testing methods as soon as they became available to us in November, particularly to do frequent testing of care home workers in our old age homes. We could have probably reduced the number of deaths of older people in those homes who mostly get the disease initially, at least the outbreaks come from care home workers. Probably could have reduced the deaths very substantially by those two differences. It's a matter of adaptive management is a risk-taking activity. If you propose an experimental or adaptive management policy that's different from what people have already been doing or thinking about, there's an inherent risk in doing that it'll backfire and things will get worse rather than better. So a lot of the emphasis in developing the kind of theory of adaptive management has actually just been using the tools and ideas of risk management theory and decision analysis to figure out when it's time to do things, it's when it's time to stop, to admit that an experiment has failed or to take credit for it succeeding.
Hmm. So
Does that make sense? Am I going
no,
too fast?
it makes great sense, but I'm just thinking that the situation that you've just described is ultimately a political situation, and politicians are risk averse by definition, because if there are side effect deaths,
Hmm.
they may be in your model, they may be worth they may be worth it because of the lives that will be saved, but politically it's intolerable, because they're going to get crap
You
from
know,
the
I,
public.
I hate to admit it, but the only politician I know of who called it correctly was that evil Trump. Trump was saying these things in September. He was trying to force an acceleration of the vaccination programs
Right.
back then. But he was, oh God, don't get me started. But if you look at what was going on here, you had basically what was called a scientific criterion for deciding when they would consider the trials to be successful. It wasn't really a scientific criterion. It was being certain enough to make people in the medical research community comfortable.
Right.
That was not a scientific thing. That was a value judgment.
Right.
And in my mind, it was a very poor value judgment.
But what I kept hearing was that under normal circumstances, it would be 2 or 3 years of clinical testing before they would approve a new vaccine for general
Mm,
use. And this was so accelerated already, and you would
yeah,
be arguing it should have been accelerated even more.
absolutely. Yeah, I'd like to think that one of the key reasons they were able to do that acceleration of the RNA viruses and so on were the grand investments and vision that Bill Gates had. I'd like to think that Bill Gates would probably agree with me about timing in this thing.
Hmm.
That the people who were making the value just judgments and politicians were just saying, we're just listening to what the scientists tell us is needed.
Yeah.
I don't think that politicians really realized that there was a strong value judgment element in the science recommendations.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. It's very, very interesting. So that's adaptive management. So it is a risk. It's a risky business that you're
yeah. So
engaged.
I promised you I'd tell you about a fish example too, or
Yeah,
you should
I was
leave
going to ask you that next.
that. Yeah. Well, we've got a situation here in British Columbia that is going to be one of the most controversial natural fisheries type management decision in many decades. A bunch of us have been watching the declines of several of our salmon stocks here on the coast, of coho salmon going almost extinct in some areas around the Georgia Strait, Chinook salmon populations, sockeye salmon declining over the last 20 years or so, 30 years, 40 years even. And a number of us have concluded that the most likely cause of those declines is the massive increase in seal and sea lion populations that occurred on our coast starting in the early 1970s when marine mammals were protected along the coast. So right now there's about twice as many seals and sea lions in the ocean off BC as there were for the last several thousand years because First Nations people harvested them extensively. So our models or calculations are that these pinnipeds are what's caused the declines of at least some of these populations. And so we've recommended that they restore the First Nations harvesting rights for these animals and First Nations fisheries for the pinnipeds, and bring their abundances back down to near what they were during Aboriginal times, which is about half as abundant as they are today. Well, obviously this is hugely controversial. We're not sure it'll work because one of the things in the biology is it's sort of subtle is we know that the seals that are eating the fish, enough fish to cause the declines from how many mammals are and how much they each eat and so on. But what we don't know is whether those little fish would have died anyway because of being set up for death by some other environmental problem like warming oceans or diseases and so on. So it is very much an experiment to allow the redevelopment of this First Nations harvesting system. But keep your eye on the news because in terms of big and nasty and huge issues of ethics and so on involved, the experiment, that's the biggest one I've been involved with in recent years.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
It's got a
think
big price tag on it. We're talking about the restoration of about $600 million a year fisheries and things like that
Mhm.
that have gone down to nothing.
But I think of the controversies around, say, the wolf cull, or the idea of, culling some of the Canada geese that are polluting the seawall where I live,
Yeah,
and the kind of push, or the coyotes in Stanley Park, um,
yeah.
and the kind of pushback that there is for that. You want open season on marine mammals. I don't know. It's a tough sell.
No, not open season. We want a very carefully regulated First Nations harvesting system that would let them redevelop some of their harvesting traditions and make some money and employ some people out in coastal communities where First Nations jobs are hard to come by.
Are the First
So I
Nations?
think about the people side of this way ahead. Than I think of the seals with their big brown eyes. I think of the First Nations young guy sitting up there in a town like Prince Rupert with no economic future. I think of his big brown eyes first.
Do you have support from those Indigenous communities?
Variable, yeah. Yeah, I think the last time I talked to the people that are organizing, trying to organize the government, get the government to do this thing, they were saying they had something like 100 First Nations communities willing to sign on and support the harvest.
Hmm. And I had another question about salmon, but it's gone. Oh, never mind.
That's It's late in the day. We're getting old, you know.
And hey, speak for yourself, buddy.
Oh, oh,
um, I know that you've got connections in Florida. You've got connections in you. Well, you mentioned that you've worked on these World Heritage Site projects in Florida and Australia, Grand Canyon. Can you talk about some of your trips, both within your kind of scholarly work and beyond that, to some of these exotic places, and Vienna, which of course seems about as likely a place for a fisheries guy as Tucson, Arizona.
yeah.
But you've been back there too, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. I did 2 sabbatical leaves there. I think the most fun I had in the second sabbatical leave when we were asked to apply our workshop modeling technology to the management of the lap reindeer herding system in
Oh
northern
yeah.
Sweden. So I went up to northern Sweden and met in this nice retreat place, and a bunch of pompous Swedish scientists and government bureaucrats and 2 little lap reindeer herders. And so the scientists, we started putting together information, and the scientists were talking away about how wonderful it was going to be and what they were going to this and that. And I was sitting there at a little Apple notebook computer, starting to type in little bits of the calculations we knew we had to do about the reindeer populations. And this little lap reindeer herder came up and looked over my shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" And so I started talking to him. And he understood right away what was going on. He started showing me how to do the calculations better. The next day, he took me out into the forest and showed me what the reindeer herders actually do and how different it was from what we were putting in the computer model. And he talked on a very broad scale about what was going wrong with their reindeer herding system. And it wasn't to do with what they do in the forest with the reindeer, which is what they thought their problem was. It's that they had built up their reindeer herds too large by relying on grass in the wintertime that they got from Swedish farms along the coast. None of the scientists had mentioned anything like this. And then he said, well, our big problem is these farms are going out of business
Mm.
and we can't get this winter feed and we can't feed our reindeer. So a problem that we thought was a forest ecology reindeer herd management problem was actually a much broader problem identified by a guy with zero formal education.
Yeah.
And a lot of the adaptive management things I've been involved in, the smartest people, the best systems thinkers were people who were not formally educated. Um, Let me just a little bit about the Florida Everglades. Buzz Halling moved from UBC to the University of Florida in the 1990s. And he invited me to come down and start working with him on the Florida Everglades, which reminds me, by the way, my very best regards in the meeting here tonight is a sort of protege of mine, Bill Pine from the University of Florida, who I came to know and love while working down there. So I started going down to the Everglades and going out in the Everglades with people and running workshops and trying to build computer models of the Everglades ecosystem and trying to figure out how to restore it. Big experiments in manipulating water flow into the Everglades system from the north.
Mm.
And that turned into a sabbatical, half of a sabbatical leave at the University of Florida, where I met Bill and others. And a whole series of wonderful adventures in Florida. We built a little cottage down there, a waterfront cottage where I could drag my kayak, walk out 25 feet to my kayak and drag it into the water and go out and catch wonderful red drum and trout and spotted sea trout and cook them on the spot. Yeah, that the kind of thing you're looking for, anecdotes?
Pretty paradisal. What about in Australia? You're working on the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, I did. Part of the same sabbatical leave, I spent several months in Townsville and got to go to most of the major parts of the Great Barrier Reef and traveling around trying to, besides just looking at the reef itself, trying to convince groups of people who, local scuba diving clubs and so on, to help us with developing visual surveys to get enough counts of fish to measure the effects of experiments that we were setting up by opening and closing reefs to various uses like fishing.
Hmm.
And then Grand Canyon, I suppose, I ended up getting appointed to Grand Canyon senior ecologist and made something like 15 raft trips on down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon over a period of about 10 years. And while I was working down there, and of all things, in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, I was working mostly on an endangered fish species that lives in the river there.
I was going to ask you about fish farms. That was going to be my big controversial question. Put you on the spot. But actually, I want to go back to something that you said in passing early on about how your grandfather lost the cattle ranch and why you became a game warden, because the city of Los Angeles had basically altered the.
Oh, okay. No, the place where I grew up called the Owens Valley is just off the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and there's a lot of streams that run down off the Sierra Nevada mountains and disappeared into the desert. In the early 1900s, the city of Los Angeles realized that they could fuel the development of the Los Angeles region if they built the world's longest aqueduct. So they built a 250-mile long aqueduct from the Owens Valley area, actually north of the Owens Valley, all the way to Los Angeles, and basically stole the water from us. There was a famous movie about this called Chinatown that talked about the crazy politics involved in the history of that. But Grandpa used to carry dynamite in his saddlebags to try to blow up the Los Angeles aqueduct. even when I was a kid, the hatred of the city of Los Angeles ran very deep in the families that were still there. And I also got to watch a major environmental disaster with the drying up of this valley as it occurred from the time we were children, when there were still wonderful artesian springs and streams and marshes and wildlife, to by the time I graduated from high school, there was almost nothing.
Wow. I know that there are all kinds of initiatives underway to try and change some of the dams around the Columbia River in Oregon to kind of bring back those some of those valleys that were that dried up because of the diversion of water. Have you ever considered going back to the Owen Valley with your adaptive management techniques and stirring up the shit out there and trying
Uh,
to get things
it-
back to?
it's interesting. They actually ran an adaptive management planning exercise on the Owens Valley and didn't invite me to be involved.
Ooh.
Somebody told them, "You don't want to get this guy in there. He knows too much." I knew the whole history of the system, and it's many, many years of running around there. So they left me out of it, but they are running an adaptive management experiment. They're restoring some of the water flows to the valley now,
Is that
on a pretty minuscule scale, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah. So that's not the Colorado River. These are just tributary.
No, tributaries to a thing called the Owens, from the to the Owens River system, that ran out into a big lake in the desert and dried up and never went to the ocean. Place
Right.
called the Owens Lake.
Now to go back to my other question, are you involved in any of the in any adaptive management um, incentives involving the relationship of fish farms to the wild salmon stock?
No, I was asked to look into that early on in the development of fish farming, look at experimental approaches to siting the farms to try to determine whether they would have any impact. I've looked at a lot of the data over the years. I've never been convinced that there actually is a real impact. There were
Really?
a couple of correlative patterns early on where pink salmon declines coincided with the buildup of the fish farms, but then those pink salmon stocks came back. I know there's a huge amount of zealous attention to blaming fish farms for everything that goes on out there. I don't blame them for anything. And in fact, what I see in the closure of the fish farms is the loss of a lot of employment in local communities that will have no beneficial effect on salmon. I'd pretty much be willing to bet that, based on all the data I've looked at, that problem's been grossly overblown
Hmm.
and has become an excuse for people to point fingers at, like people like to do, rather than facing the real problems.
So do you feel that you're I mean, I know that you're an environmentalist, and yet everything that you've talked about seems to be really kind of radically data driven, that if the data says this, then you're simply going to kind of follow the data and not your own perhaps natural inherent tendencies. Is that a fair thing to say? And did you find that
Absolutely.
to be you find that
My
to be
little sister and I have two nieces in California who are avid Trump supporters. And they truly believe that the election was rigged, that all manner of lies were told, that no amount of empirical evidence from this world could convince them to change their faith. So I find that that kind of human behavior, faith-based decision making, is utterly abhorrent, uh, and that the ultimate result of it is goofballs like my niece, who's a QAnon supporter. Nieces who are QAnon supporters.
Wow.
That's what you get when you don't pay attention to the facts and the data, and you don't let. My grandpa used to have a nice saying about that. He says, "Mother has Mother Nature has no sympathy for fools who don't pay attention.
So again, it seems to me that there's this kind of natural common sense politics that runs through your genes from at least a couple of generations before you,
Mhm.
that has guided your what you
Well,
told me when we first talked, your lucky life.
yeah, absolutely. And and I think even more important than being guided by the data is that my attitude is that people first. But if it came down to a hard trade-off that couldn't be avoided between people and the environment, the things I love about nature and people, I think I'd have to come down on the people side, and that comes from my family's experience and how horrible it was for them to lose their livelihoods and way of life uh, because of some supposed higher purpose.
Yeah. So your sister has written a chat. Our father grieved for the loss of fish and game when the Owens Valley dried up. However, he always felt that the valley was saved from development because of the transport of water to Los Angeles. I am a traitor living in Los Angeles.
Indeed. Thank you, little sister. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that's a positive side. Although right near us is a very rapidly developing area that the people have discovered as a place to get out of the city and live. It's a little town called Bishop. It's become a horrid suburban sprawl.
How far is your birth town from LA proper?
It's exactly halfway between LA and Reno, about 220 miles north of
Okay.
LA and 240 miles south of Reno.
Okay, so it's a
Mm.
long it's a long ways away to be a bedroom community, but I can see it, the attraction of
Yeah,
people from the metropolis, the megalopolis, wanting a little fresh air and clean.
yeah. When
Yeah.
we were kids, one of the things we used to do to make a little money was to sell worms to fishermen coming from Los Angeles on the opening weekend of fishing season. And this was neat to watch because we could drive up on a mountainside above town and we could look down across the desert and we could see the highway for about 70 miles south towards Los Angeles. And just at dark, the night before the fishing season started, there was a solid line of lights, of bumper to bumper traffic of people coming from Los Angeles to come to the mountains to go trout fishing. Always impressed upon me the distance across that desert that it was from LA. And people were still willing to invest the time and effort to get to the areas where I grew up and beyond into the mountains.
Mm. Do you have? I know you said that you built a place in Florida, which I know you don't have any longer. Do you have a cottage, a cabin, a getaway in the woods somewhere up here?
Yeah, we have a little, luckily, an industrial zoned waterfront lot in Seashell, low bank, sandy beach, but zoned industrial, so we got it cheap, right on Seashell Inlet. So we go up there and spend some of our time. And I can go out fishing with my kayak and out, same thing as I did in Florida, right out the back door. Don't have to get a great big stink pot boat and race around.
Nice, nice. Well, I think we should probably open up the floor here for questions. I don't see any additional chats. There's a little love note from Bill Pine to Uncle Carl, who says he misses you very much. I think we'll call it an evening. It's dinner time. Carl, that was really, really fascinating. Thank you for your continued exploration of adaptive management and the world. Thank you all for attending, and hope we see you again in fall.
Hi, Alon and Patricia and others I can't see. Night, night.